Bueno, antes de comenzar con el video que ustedes quiero que trabajen, Luis Pozo,
Señor, buenas noches.
buenas noches. En la plataforma, Luis, hay en el capítulo, perdón, en la sesión de hoy,
Sí.
sesión 9, hay un libro que habla de teorías de la personalidad. Entonces, Luis, por favor, para mañana, quiero que en ese libro hay varios autores teóricos de la personalidad. Entonces, Luis, busque en ese libro a Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler. Le voy a repetir, a deletrear el apellido. A, D, L,
Sí.
E, R.
Listo, profe.
Alfred Adler. Entonces, para mañana, por favor, Luis, para que nos colabores con eso, por favor.
Y digamos que tengo que socializarle lo que el señor dijo o algo así.
Sí, sí,
Okay.
¿cuál
Sobre
es,
la teoría de la
cuál es la
personalidad.
teoría de
Okay.
personalidad de Alfred Adler? ¿Ok?
Listo, profe, todo bien.
Listo, bonito. Roger. Hola, Roger. Roger, su merced también, por favor, Roger. En ese mismo libro de la sesión 9, ahí está el libro de teorías de la personalidad y te vas a centrar en Erik Erikson. ¿Listo, hermano? Para mañana, ¿listo? Okay.
Sí, señor.
Ok, gracias. Leandra. Hola, Leandra.
Sí, señor.
¿Cómo está, Leandra?
Bien, gracias.
Bien, Leandra, hazme un favor. En ese texto,
Señor.
también en ese libro de la sesión 9, está un autor, bueno, realmente son dos, pero los dos hablan de la misma teoría de personalidad. Se llama John Dollar y Neil Miller. Dollar y Miller. Se pronunciaría Miller, doble L, Miller. Dollar y Miller. Entonces, en ese texto que te digo, que le he dicho a los dos compañeros, también está estos personajes para que lo trabajes para mañana, nos hagas esa presentación de esa teoría.
Listo, profe.
Listo, Leandro, te agradezco. Y terminamos, Natalia Sarmiento.
Sí, señor.
Natalia, por favor, tú trabaja de ese mismo libro a George Kelly, para mañana. Entonces mañana comenzamos con ustedes ese tema. Bueno, esos teóricos de la personalidad. Ahora sí, vamos a ver este video. Permítanme, les comparto este video que pues nos va a contextualizar mucho más en el tema de la personalidad.
So you'll just talk to Ryan.
I'm talking to you. Are you Ryan?
Yeah.
Hi, Ryan. Jackie. Nice to meet you.
Jackie.
Personality.
The overall.
What's personality? Very diverse thing, I would say.
How would it? It's interesting.
Personality is
I don't even know what to say.
I don't know, your surroundings, your friends growing up, how your parents raised you, what's in your gene pool, just everything is who you are.
What is personality?
It's very hard to define. I suppose you know that, or you wouldn't be asking this kind of question.
Personality is not that easy to define. There are many definitions, academic definitions, and they're not very satisfactory.
It's I guess it's the core of the individual. It's what makes them socially, at least, distinctive.
Disposition is a good synonym for personality.
Your core wiring of how you react to things, how you behave, what kind of things you think about, what motivates you, how you feel.
Personality is the characteristic, systematic ways that we interact with the world.
Personality is a person's probability to do something.
You'd say somebody has a particular type of personality, means they behave in a particular type of way, they nearly always behave in that type of way, and they do so consistently over time and across situations.
Personality affects everything that we do. It affects how we view the world, how we interpret what we see.
There is real value in understanding why someone ticks the way they tick.
Personality psychology is about the nature of human nature. How you think about human nature frames all subsequent discussions.
So then the question comes, why are we all different, and why does that difference matter?
Human behavior is essentially social or interpersonal. And throughout an analysis of all forms of societies and civilizations from very ancient times until our days, there are three constant characteristics. Number one, that people have always lived in groups, and they will always live in groups. So essentially, we're social animals. Number two, that groups always have a hierarchy with a well-defined structure of power and somebody who's in charge, a leader. And number three is that people need to have a system of meaning, a formal system of meaning like religion, philosophy, science that helps them make sense of the world. And as a consequence of these three well-known generalizations of human behavior, we know that there are three main motives or core drivers that people will always have.
One is to get along with others because we are creatures of groups, if you will, of groups of people. And the second is to be successful, to get ahead within that group.
Getting along is about bonding with other people, getting close to others, being appreciated, experiencing warmth, empathy. And we need to do this, whether it's with our romantic partners, our friends, or our work colleagues. Getting ahead is about competing with other people. And it's quite interesting that in any environment, including the workplace, there is a very complex tension between getting along and getting ahead.
Personalities are different. You know, we all bring ourselves to work every day. And in business, particularly in a tough economy that is highly competitive, you run the risk of people competing internally as opposed to competing externally.
There's always a problem in a boardroom because that's the dynamic. The dynamic is everybody wants to become the CEO, and they've all got to pretend to get along with each other, but they all want to get ahead of each other. Getting along and getting ahead it can be reconciled in the sense of getting along with people is about cooperation. And getting ahead of people doesn't have to be about competitive in the win-lose sense, but can be in the win-win sense. So you can be getting ahead of people, but bringing them along with you.
And then there is finding meaning, the third master motive, which is key to understanding how people make decisions.
Religion is a cultural universal. That tells you something interesting about people. I think what that tells you about people is that people have a deep-seated, built-in, biologically based need for meaning, structure, and order in their lives.
Humans are hardwired to get along, get ahead, and find meaning. How people work toward those goals and the extent to which they achieve them is determined by their personalities.
Personality determines what people do in general, but some people are a lot more influential than others, and that's because they are in positions of leadership. And if we understand what those people are like, how they get along, how they get ahead, how they find meaning, we will be able to predict how the group or other people, the followers, will behave.
The real issue is how successful is group effectiveness. You can only have a successful career if you're in an effective group.
Groups came about quite naturally, and it was a function of survival. In Neanderthal days, to survive, you had to survive with others. Survival of the fittest was not an individual matter.
There's competition within groups for status. There's competition between groups for survival. Warfare was the most important factor driving human evolution.
It was a matter of whether or not we as a group can defeat the animals that are trying to kill us, if not the other people across the river, human beings like us who are trying to get the resources they think we have.
And so it was a time when you got these groups living in the forest in competition for one another, and the competition is quite deadly. You're living here, they're living there. They, at some point, decide they like your resources better than their resources. They come to get your resources. They don't come with their lawyers. They come, you know, to get it. And if they're successful, they don't just take your resources away from you, they kill you, and they eat you. And if you're someone else's dinner, that means you disappear from the gene pool, and there goes your reproductive success.
But I think probably what evolved was something we refer to today as leadership, and that is that some of the people in the group were much more skilled at being able to help us to survive than others. And so we tended to follow those that seemed to know more about what the hell they were doing than just any of us.
That's why leadership is so important. It's a fundamental resource for the group, for the survival and the effectiveness of teams.
Where did the first theory of leadership come from? It came from something called the great man theory.
It looked at what are the characteristics inside people that make them good leaders. And what you do is you get the good presidents and the bad presidents and the good generals and the bad generals and the good this and the bad that. And you find out what they have in common.
So Alexander the Great would be compared with, say, Julius Caesar. And if there were similarities between the two, we're onto something. Then you would take that profile of the two of them and compare it with, say, Napoleon, and to see what was in common with all three.
And the assumption is that all the good ones had this in common, and therefore that makes you a good leader.
Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon had some things in common. Number one, all three were short. Today, you know, if you're not 6'2", you're not gonna make it. All three were left-handed. The third thing they all had in common, at various stages of each man's life, each one contracted venereal disease. So therefore we can conclude, can't we, that a successful leader is one who is short, left-handed, and risk-taker. How about that?
And that was quite popular. The problem was, when you were a historian, you had your list, and when I was a political scientist, I had my list, and that psychologist had their list, and we disagreed on our lists. And then after the war in Ohio, they started coming up with style literature. They said it's not to do with your personality and your ability, it's the way in which you lead. The 1960s came along, we said, oh, there's no such thing as personality, there's no such thing as leadership. And people would say, well, why do you do that? Well, they say, well, there's leadership for war and leadership for peace, leadership for change and leadership for stability. And there's no such thing as a leader. There are just situations which throw up leaders. And then the 1980s popped along, and there's every type of leadership. There's servant leadership and non-leadership leadership and tele-leadership and blah, blah, blah. And a whole range of people who just add the word leadership at the end of something or the other. And I think we're coming full circle.
There is no one person model for leadership. But if you want to be successful, you better know yourself, and you better understand your teammates.
You know, a great sales generator who hits their sales targets and above year after year isn't necessarily a good leader. They could simply be a good sales deliverer, and that's okay.
There's a very high correlation between leader personality and business results, and for years this was put up, but nobody really understood how it worked.
In hindsight, we know what made someone a good leader. We can take it apart. Taking it from the other end of the telescope is a much more difficult game.
An effective leader is somebody who leads an effective team.
In fact, that's a definition of power. Power is when A gets B to do something that B would not otherwise do. That's power. What is leadership? The exercise of power.
So leadership is about getting people to pull together for a limited period of time to work together toward a common purpose. So personality drives leadership, leadership drives organizational effectiveness, and then it all comes back around like this.
Who you are determines how you lead, and how you lead determines how groups and teams function, which determines how organizations function.
So everybody kind of devolves to investing in marketing skills, or I need to learn digital, or I need to learn more about finance or treasury or whatever else, and that's fine. But to me, the real challenge is learning about leadership, learn about yourself, how you can become better as a leader and never stop learning.
So it's about personality, and it's about the engagement of the leader with the follower in that relationship.
I think everybody wants from their leader somebody to be kind and thoughtful and empathic and warm and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, the literature says that that is not associated with good leadership. Why? They find it difficult to give people negative feedback, and as you Americans say, kick ass. They don't kick ass when ass needs to be kicked.
In the end, it's about whether you effectively got a group of people together to punch above their weight and to be successful.
It's one thing for us to have prototypes, stereotypes of what makes for great leadership, and see somebody who matches that stereotype or prototype. But that's very different, leader emergence, from leader effectiveness. I mean, if being perceived as being right for the leadership role is the same as actually being right for the leadership role, why do we have so many bad leaders? Why isn't it that every selection decision of a leader, which is based on how we perceive the person, doesn't translate into somebody who's really good at it?
So how do we determine who's going to be a good leader? What if we could know what kind of a leader a person would be? We would need to know what that person is like, what their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, fears, and values are. Sounds like a job for a psychologist, right? Well, ask the average person to name a psychologist, and 9 times out of 10, they'll say,
I don't want to say Freud.
Freud, see?
Freud.
Freud. I guess Frasier off Cheers doesn't count.
Sheesh. Freud? I mean, you know, duh.
Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud did for psychology what Albert Einstein did for physics. He popularized it.
Freud and his guys invented the modern study of personality psychology.
When you read Freudian psychology, it's enormously captivating. It's captivating in the sense how it explains things.
What was his major contribution? That we have an unconscious, and that unconscious does drive behavior.
In other words, the reasons why we do most things are kind of removed from our consciousness or awareness. So even though we might think that we're doing something because of A, it's really B, C, and D that are motivating our behavior.
They argued that the most important generalization you can make about people is that everyone's somewhat neurotic, which means that the most important problem in life is to overcome your neurosis, which means the goal of psychological assessment is to identify the sources of your neurosis.
It's called depth psychology because they try to scratch the surface and dive deeper to the kind of depths of their unconscious or you know, their repressed or hidden fantasies. It's a noble but very challenging, almost impossible quest.
Unfortunately, you know, just as chemists aren't interested in the alchemists anymore. Alchemy is interesting in the past, so Freud is the past.
That set the agenda for 100 years.
And when you read the Freudians, you get at the same time enormously frustrated by the fact it's not proven or not provable.
So diving too deep into a person's mind might be an interesting metaphysical exercise, but it doesn't really help us predict what people will do.
I think a lot of Freudian psychology is plainly wrong. However, I do think the man was a genius, and I think you can't help but understanding the power of one man's insight.
Freud would say the you that you think you are is hardly worth knowing because you made that all up. 100 years of research on the you that you think you are has gone nowhere.
So there are two different sides of personality. Personality according to ourselves.
It's, you know, the secret private you that's so important to you.
That's what we call identity or our private self. And that's invisible to other people.
If you're thinking about yourself and and how your identity is impacting your performance in the workplace, that has some benefit potentially to you, but it's just a story. It's just a story you made up about yourself. But the you that we know, your reputation, is absolutely critical.
The you that we think you are is the basis in terms of which people hire you, fire you, marry you.
So what matters in the real world is what other people think of you, not what you think of yourself.
As humans, we look at other people and we abstract from their behavior certain principles that we ascribe to them as personality.
Based on what I think your reputation is, I'm going to anticipate your performance. I'm going to anticipate how I deal with you. I'm going to make a whole lot of judgments about you and how I interact with you.
Whether they think that you're honest, whether they think that you're competent, that you're trustworthy, that you're fun to work with, all those things are the most consequential aspects of personality in relation to employability and career success.
As Shakespeare would say, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. What characters think about themselves, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, fears, values, and theories about how to get along, get ahead, and find a meaning. This is their personality from the inside. This is their identity.
The actor's view on personality is what Freud was talking about. The actor's view of personality is the you that you think you are. And 100 years of research on that hasn't gone anywhere. Reputation is the you that we think you are. The you that we think you are is really consequential. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Your reputation is a summary of your past behavior. Therefore, your reputation is the best data source we have regarding your future behavior. Modern assessment psychology starts after World War I. The Germans lost, barely, but they lost. They concluded the reason they lost was because of a failure of leadership. And they said, if there's going to be another war, we need to get better leadership in place. And so in response to those issues of failure of leadership, they invented the Modern Assessment Center as a technique for finding leadership.
Tasked with a new generation of leaders for the German army was Max Simonet. As head of military psychology, he was the main source of information for the selection of Nazi army officers. For Simonet, the most important key in the selection and promotion of officers in the German army was the assessment of personality. He developed a 4-part test for evaluating candidates based on intelligence or practical judgment, action, or stress tolerance, expressiveness, or reactionary body language and life history, or worldview and education. And it shook the world of psychology.
And in about 1930, a very smart, successful Boston area psychiatrist named Morton Prince decided he wanted to teach personality psychology to Harvard undergraduates. He hired 2 guys, a fellow named Henry Murray and a fellow named Donald McKinnon, to run it. And they were both fluent in German. They went to Germany to see what the Germans were doing around psychological assessment, and they brought the German Military Assessment Center back to Harvard.
And we learned from that, but incorporated that learning into the way the U.S. would do it.
The war broke out, and Roosevelt, FDR, wanted to start a spy agency, basically. And there's a really smart, charismatic, clever World War I hero named William Donovan, who was a Wall Street lawyer and a Wall Street money guy. Donovan was a stud. He was a handsome guy. He was a hero. He was smart. He was charismatic. Roosevelt appointed him to be the first director of something called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. So Donovan took over to develop this first ever intelligence service. And he and Murray were pals. Murray, the Harvard Psychological Clinic guy, they were both rich guys from New York. The word is that they were sleeping with the same women. So they were, pretty tight, as those things go. So Murray and McKinnon bring the Harvard Psychological Clinic to OSS to set up as a way of identifying high-level talent to do spies and dirty tricks during World War II.
Henry Murray was one of the psychologists that was heavily involved. And he had this long list of motives and personality characteristics.
And then they put all of those perspectives around the table to come up with a composite picture of each candidate's personality. Today, we would use a much more structured, replicable approach to doing that.
Over time, researchers factor analyzed all of the data, and they came out with the 5 statistically derived dimensions that are known today.
But around that room were some very smart people with tremendous insight into personality, and it was really a landmark kind of study.
And so that's how the big 5 factors came about.
The five-factor model of personality is the idea that there are five basic or core dimensions that can be used to describe normal people.
The research on the five-factor model started a long time ago. It was a guy named Gordon Allport at Harvard, put together a dictionary of all the terms that exist in the English language that are used to describe other people.
So imagine that we have thousands of potential adjectives that can be used to describe people. Friendly, fun, boring, outgoing, volatile, erratic, and a lot of these words have something in common.
So the field of personality psychology was completely fractionated by people studying little teeny topics that interested them.
The five-factor model helps simplify that approach by taking the literally hundreds of personality scales that went under different names but maybe essentially measured the same things, to classify them in a reasonable taxonomy.
And these five factors have been discovered, rediscovered repeatedly since the 1930s.
By and large, nearly all psychologists everywhere will work within big five-factor space. I think we can all talk to each other now. So we're on the same page. In that sense, it's been really good news.
Assessment has a job to do. Assessment's about predicting non-test performance. The problem in psychological assessment is to predict outcomes. And it's not about measuring traits. And when they were talking about the five-factor model, they're really talking about measuring traits, about which I don't care.
There are two main approaches to personality assessment. They really have quite different implications. So the first one argues that personality assessment should focus on measuring or assessing traits.
It sort of takes us all the way back to the issue of reputation. I prefer to think of traits as just the descriptive terms that are used in reports when you're providing somebody with information about personality. I'm not truly measuring traits, those are just labels.
So the trait approach to personality is not very useful in order to predict and understand what people will be doing. The second approach focuses on validity or predicting outcomes. And this is the most useful approach to personality assessment and is the one that has been used most successfully in organizations.
So I think if you're really going to get down to the brass tacks of what makes personality data useful, it's when we moved away from, gee, I'm going to tell you about all these traits about yourself, and we started to tell people, here's how you're going to be perceived in the workplace based on this descriptive, this reputational snapshot. That's what really was the turning point.
So one of the things that I think really comes out of, one of the powerful things that comes out of personality, it helps you to understand yourself and it helps you control yourself. But the trouble is, many leaders don't have any incentive to control themselves. There's nobody is going to tell them the truth. There's nobody going to warn them. There's nobody going to restrain them. Nobody has the guts to stand up to them. And they believe they're being authentic. You know, this word authentic, they kind of latch onto this and say, I'm an authentic leader, you know, follow me or go to hell sort of thing. But you may be following them to hell as well. So leaders crash and burn by being too much themselves often, by not really understanding when they have to turn down the volume or when they have to change their behavior to meet changing circumstances.
What I know is the enormous power of an individual leader to cause doom and destruction. That, you know, one person can lead a whole organization of many, many people into chaos. One individual can do this. Never underestimate the power of a really bad leader to cock things up.
In the summer of 1996, Albert Dunlap, better known as Chainsaw Al, became the chairman and CEO of Sunbeam Products. Dunlap was known in the corporate world as a downsizing specialist. Almost immediately, Dunlap cut more than 6,000 jobs at Sunbeam, closing more than half a dozen plants and factories across the United States. However, no community was hit harder than Coushatta, Louisiana. In a town of 2,000, the closure of the Sunbeam factory took with it more than 500 jobs. The town was devastated. 2 years later, the SEC opened an investigation into Dunlap and his questionable accounting practices. The Sunbeam Board of Directors had no choice but to fire him, less than 2 years after bringing him in to save the company.
People are the most dangerous, consequential forces on earth. Wouldn't it be sensible to know something about people?
All of us have what one might call a dark side, and all really a dark side is a set of characteristics that are not very attractive when they're demonstrated.
The dark side most often shows up when people are under stress or uncomfortable or even insecure.
When our guard is down, when we're just being ourselves.
So our dark side are essentially our derailers, the things that get in the way of our success.
I am more interested in what those who fail and cock up than those who succeed. And when you look at very successful leaders who've derailed, they've nearly always been very successful. They've nearly always been in the talent group and the wunderkinds and that sort of thing.
At the end of the day, the dark side really is based in our own fears.
Dark side characteristics can also be seen as overused strengths. So, for example, being bold or arrogant can often be adaptive. You know, if I'm under pressure, I may impose my views on other people and try to intimidate them, seduce them, or even bully them. And in the short run, that might be an effective coping strategy for myself. But in the long run, it will probably actually alienate people and question my ability to inspire others.
If you have a leader who is good-looking, intelligent, articulate, socially skilled, and bold and mischievous, they are lethal because they can go into organizations, they can charm their way, and their boldness helps them up, and so does their mischievousness.
Describe it like bubbles in a champagne glass. You know, at the very bottom, when the bubbles emerge, they're imperceptibly small. And then they rise to the top, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then pop when they reach the surface. And that's our kind of analogy for the trajectory of leaders. They have the determination and the power and the strategies and the methods, whether it's politically or whatever, to get to the top. And by the time they get to the top, they're not restraining themselves very much anymore. So the dark side emerges, and maybe with self-destructive effect.
The bright side of personality relates to a person's strengths and the factors that are likely to help them advance their career and manage other people effectively.
The bright side of personality is our sort of public persona, those aspects of our personality that we manage to some extent. It's when we're presenting ourselves to the rest of the world at our most socially effective.
So when you join an organization, you're all bright side. You'll have everything under control. You haven't yet learned how you can behave in this organization, so you're just being careful what you do. But as with every move up the ladder, you are more impressed with yourself as you impress other people.
So the bright side is much more about what are the strengths that we can bring to bear to a situation? How can we capitalize on the natural skills and talents that we've got?
And as you go up the ladder, you get more lonely. The cohort gets smaller until you're on your own at the top. And at that point, nobody is speaking truth to power. No one's telling you you're a fool, or that's a stupid idea. Everyone's saying how great it was. So the dark side emerges, and maybe with self-destructive effect.
I've had bosses who were not always there for me when I needed something, who it seemed every time I was trying to make money for the company or make a deal, they were trying to stop it so that I didn't move ahead in the company because my bosses were afraid I would get their job, or sat down and took an idea from me and then gave it to the boss as their idea. I mean, those are bad bosses.
We're driving around, and he saw sandbags on the side of the street. They were obviously left from a recent festival to be picked up by the sandbag company. And he stopped and said, "Quick, help me load these up. I need sandbags."
And your name's Ryan, right?
Yeah.
Hi, Ryan. You've done a good job today. I just want to thank you for coming into work today. And, how's the wife? Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And I noticed that you left at 4:55 the other day, and just wanted to document that you left, and it wasn't a lot of people were talking about it. You're 5 minutes early, so I have a good weekend. And, you know what? Ugh.
There are countless examples of great and terrible bosses in history. One of the best was a general of the Union Army during the American Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. Far from perfect, he was able to get the best out of an army that was teetering on disaster.
Grant was, if you read his biography, he's clearly really smart. He was known as really straight, really honest, really good judgment. Obviously knew what he was talking about. The war started, and he was running working for his father-in-law, running a hardware store in Cincinnati. The Army of the Potomac was losing. Those generals in Washington, the regular guys that had been picked by the establishment, weren't getting it done. They were getting their ass handed to them by the Southerners. So they put him in charge of like a little squad. Well, he won. So then they put him in charge of a company. He won. Then they put him in charge of a battalion. He won. He never lost a fight. And then the word finally got to Washington. There's this guy out there that's kicking the shit out of the Confederates. Then Lincoln said, well, yeah, maybe we need to get him in here. And he said, no, he's a drunk. Lincoln said, well, I'd send him a barrel of whiskey. He fights, and at every point, you know, he had all those fuckers in Washington climbing his back. He had, everybody in Washington was trying to do him in. I mean, it was constant backbiting and subverting him. And he had to just keep going and keep going. It was real, you know, just really hard. And so they brought him in, and he turned it around, and he defeated the South at the end of the war. He led from...
Vamos a terminar allí. El video lo podemos encontrar, lo pueden encontrar ustedes allí en la plataforma para que lo terminemos de ver. Ya quedan como 5 o 6 minutos para que lo puedan terminar. Fíjense entonces que cuando nosotros hablamos de personalidad, lo asociamos con carácter, lo asociamos con liderazgo, lo asociamos con muchos factores, que ahí lo mencionaban como el lado oscuro, el lado brillante, y estamos hablando de nosotros mismos, estamos hablando de las características que tenemos nosotros, y que unos tenemos en mayor cantidad cierto tipo de características que otros, pero nosotros tenemos más cosas diferentes a los demás. Entonces, eso nos identifica, eso nos hace ser mucho más hábiles, tener muchas más destrezas, tener una inteligencia, digámoslo, que está asociada con mi forma de ser atrevido, de ser lanzado, de ser una persona muy que asume riesgos, ¿no? Entonces, en este video resumimos muchas de las cosas que hemos visto en el transcurso del módulo hasta hoy y que hace parte del texto de lo que tiene que ver con la personalidad. Entonces, con lo que mañana vamos a ver, que los compañeros muy amablemente nos van a compartir, cerramos el tema de personalidad. Pero es un tema muy enriquecedor, muy interesante y eso se trabaja todo el tiempo. Muchachos, muchas gracias. Nos veremos entonces mañana. Que pasen una feliz noche, por favor, cuídense. Y creo que ya entramos o estamos próximos a entrar a cuarentena nuevamente, entonces, por favor, juiciosos en la casa. Una feliz noche para todos.
Gracias, profe.
Gracias, profe.
Gracias,
profe. Feliz
Cuídense,
noche.
que estén bien. Chao, juiciosos.
Chao,
Chao.
profe. Gracias.
Chao, profe.
Chao, muchachos. Chao.